Okay, picking up where we left off on page 95, we're talking about listing all the tasks. So you create a task ID or a task number, you list all the things, what their duration is, and whether or not there's a relationship where things have to come before something else. So that's essentially what that's all about. Estimating the task duration, you don't really just want to guess. Hopefully you'll have something else in there. But the task could be something simple as like hours or days or weeks when you're putting these things together. And when you set one of these guys up, when you say week, it's going to ask you, do you mean a work week or just a regular week? And there's a way you can do it there and say, WD for work week and W for calendar week. There's some really cool ways you can go in and tell it precisely what you're talking about. So if the task uses days, the unit of measures are usually called person days. That kind of makes sense. And person day represents the work that one person can complete in one day. You guys know that. Because behind the scenes, while you're putting this thing together, it's trying to figure out what resources are required. And you've probably heard the story about, you can overbook people. The story about digging a post hole. If it takes one man 10 minutes to dig a post hole, well, then you could get 10 men to dig that same post hole in a minute. It's like, no. There's an awful lot involved here. You can't just crank up the personnel list to make it go twice as fast. There are some declining abilities here. Okay, so factors that affect the duration. In addition to just your ability to estimate, okay, it's going to take 5 hours to do this or 5 days to do that. There's project size. It's almost like a multiplication factor you have to throw in. If you're doing a monstrously big task, then doing simple things might take a little bit longer. That's just effective time. So you can identify all these projects and how much time is needed to perform them, and then allow time for doing meetings and paperwork and project reviews and training and all these other distractors, because you can't just talk about the portion of the time that's productive. That's not going to work. Okay. And then, of course, human resources. In some cases, when you're putting together a project, you may not actually have all the people you need to begin with. And one of your tasks is going to be going out and hiring some developers or some database people or whatever the case may be. And so you don't know. Am I just going to be able to put an ad in the paper and everybody's going to show up and we're done? And that's going to be easy peasy. We'll be done in a couple of days. Or you're going to put something out on Monster and be spending weeks interviewing potential candidates and then they'll have to give 2 weeks notice to their current, all that stuff. So the human resource piece is actually the piece that has the most amount of flexibility and the least amount of specificity. It's where things can go wrong in a hurry. Okay, so continuing on page 97, they talk about, so when you display this work breakdown structure, you talk about, you can have experience with similar projects. That works really, really well. Develop time and cost estimates based upon the resources for similar or previously developed. Use expertise from projects that were developed in a different environment. And then, of course, the constraints. And we talked about the constraints when we talked about the three-sided triangle thing. Three-sided triangle. I guess all triangles are three-sided. Oh, well. Talked about, the conditions, work conditions, the restrictions, the requirements. And then, of course, how are you going to achieve them in the most realistic way. So on page 98, they basically talk about how you translate between this type of a list into a Gantt or a PERT chart. Okay, so now that we've got the WBSs built and kind of sort of assembled, now we have to look at those and determine whether there's something going on, and what the book calls patterns. You identify task patterns. I would have preferred they called it identifying task dependencies. That would have made a little bit more sense to me, because pattern, they start on Tuesday. That's a pattern. Okay, so tasks depend on each other and must be performed in sequence. That makes sense. You can't do one without the other. Or, of course, you can have multiple things that can run simultaneously. And just because they can run simultaneously doesn't necessarily mean that they should. If you have a bunch of independent tasks and you say, well, why not? I'll schedule them all to run simultaneously. Well, you just popped your budget up for your personnel. If it's not time dependent, well, then spread it out and have those same people performing the task. Otherwise, you have to have a larger crew. So there's an awful lot involved in figuring these things out. So it talks about how do I use these task boxes to create a model. And the task box is just a little simple thing. It's only got like 5 squares. It talks about, the task, the start date, duration, the ID, and whether or not it's dependent on anything else. You can look in the book. There's plenty of examples on page 98, for example. Okay, and so this task pattern thing, it's got the task name, the ID, duration, start date, finish date. Okay. On page 99, they talk about dependent tasks. And this is just like it sounds. I have to complete task number 5 before I can even start on task number 6. There's no way I can start 6 unless 5 is done beforehand. Okay, that kind of makes sense. It's dependent because one depends on another. And it's just like a relay race. I mean, if you're running a relay race, the first round the guy has to hand the baton over to the next guy and he takes off. And if they don't hand the baton over, the second guy doesn't go. Okay. There are other things, what's called multiple successor tasks, when multiple things have to come together. Now, they don't have to have necessarily the same end date, but it takes 3 things to occur before I can go to this next step. And so, yep, now instead of just being a linear kind of a thing, it kind of becomes like a spider web where you have lots and lots and lots of tasks all pointing together into one particular task. So several tasks can start at the same time. It doesn't matter if they have to start at the same time. Each is called a concurrent task because they're consuming resources concurrently. And often 2 or more concurrent tasks depend on a single prior task. Okay, in other words, 1 goes into 3, and then you can have 3 going into 1. Okay, so the multiple predecessor tasks, same scenario except in the opposite direction. Instead of having 1 task blossoming into 3, it's 3 tasks that are converging into 1. So little diagrams on page 99, for example, show this fairly well. Okay, and then on page 100 they say, well, how do I identify these patterns? Because I'm looking at this and it's all just a bunch of words and I'm kind of confused. So they give you some hints. And a lot of this is just pure common sense. But hey, look for words like when or then or and when something has to be completed. For example, do task 1, then do task 2. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Or when task 2 is finished, start task 3. It's just, we're talking about just English language. And most people don't have a problem with this. You just read the task list as people describe them, and you can fairly easily figure out the relationship between them and which ones are dependent on what. I will tell you that if you're wrong, okay, and you make a mistake, you're probably going to run into some real problems. It'll be one of those scenarios where the crane doesn't arrive and you're sitting around with nothing to do and everyone just kind of goes home until the crane arrives. That's very bad for business. Okay, so how do you do complex patterns? Well, complex patterns are really what the PERT and CPM charts are all about. They show them all, because you could have, instead of something being clean, 1 going into 3 and 3 going into 1, you could have this very convoluted kind of a mess. So on page 100 they show one of those bizarre examples of this like figure 3-20, where there's dependencies and there's multiple tasks, multiple successors, and multiple predecessor tasks all thrown in together into a mess. So basically, yes, you do have to study the facts very, very carefully, and woe be you if you get it wrong. Okay, so continuing on, the third step is figuring out the critical path. And the critical path is exactly what it sounds like. It's those steps that, if they don't occur, it's going to adversely affect the entire project. The critical path. And it's pretty simple to kind of sort of figure out. You just figure out those things, you know, through your Gantt chart or your PERT chart. And there's an example. So, for example, in this particular case, here's a fairly complex list of tasks. And if I want to know which path from point A to point B, which path is the critical path, it's actually pretty simple. Here's one that has a duration of 4 and duration of 17. So which one's going to be the most critical? Here's one with 70 and 10. 30 and 25, 25, 25, 20. So it actually turns out that the one that's the most critical is this one. If you add up all the durations on this path, this is the one that is the one that's the most critical. It's not saying these guys aren't all that relevant. It's just that if programming fails, then the whole project gets stretched out. Or programming test fails, the whole project gets stretched out. So it's the most time or the least time, depending on how you're looking at it, to figuring out the critical path. So the way it's done, we review a series of tasks which, if delayed, would affect the completion date of the overall project. If any task on a critical path falls behind, then the entire project will be delayed. Yep. And you review the patterns, determine the start and finish dates, and which will determine the critical path. Okay. So on page 203, they talk about project monitoring and control. So your job as a project monitor isn't just to crack the whip. You're also going to have to go in and kind of measure how you're doing. You said you were going to have 70 days to do programming, and you're 35 days in. You need to go talk to them and say, hey, how you guys doing? Because if you don't talk to them, you're probably not going to be able to keep your schedule. So there's a technique which they call a structured walkthrough. Basically where you go to them and you say, okay, tell me where you are. I mean, that's basically what a structured walkthrough is. You know, you walk into whoever's doing a task ID 2 and say, okay, is everything okay? You got everything? You're going to meet your deadlines? Yep. Okay, good. So you kind of go through that. So the tasks associated with maintaining a schedule are kind of complex, and you have to kind of be looking out for the negative side. You have to be looking out for the disasters, where you try to anticipate problems. You know, don't just wait for something to happen. You anticipate the problems, try to avoid the problems if humanly possible. You know, minimize their impact if you can't avoid them. Identify the potential solutions if there is an issue like that, and select the best way to solve the problem. So, you know, project management is like any other tasks. You can be really good at it by leaning forward in the saddle and seeing what's on the horizon and being able to say, well, okay, it doesn't look like that's going to work. Instead of using a crane to lift the roofing material, let's go get one of those little hand elevators. You know, something. You know, you're going to be able to provide an alternative to whatever is causing the loss of that critical path. Okay, so on page 104 they talk about reporting, and I kind of mentioned before that reporting kind of falls into two categories. You know, internal reporting. You know, when you go in and talk to the guy that's doing the program testing on day 76, you're not going to be talking to him the same as when you talk to a project. Corporate management, talking about the entire project. So, you know, you have regularly scheduled meetings with the key people to make sure everything's working. That's a very good technique, although most people detest meetings. This is probably a good place to stop for the 15-minute mark, and we'll catch you again in just a few.